Hi everyone, my name is Beau Ferreira. For my fermentation 82, I produced a selection of misos using different grains for the initial Koji substrate. Miso is a fermented legume product originating in Japan, but with variations throughout Asia. It consists of a two-stage solid-state fermentation in which starches, proteins, and fats undergo enzymatic conversion to sugars, amino acids, and fatty acids, resulting in an umami-flavored savory paste used as a condiment, soup base, and flavor enhancer. During the first stage of fermentation, grain substrates such as rice, seeds, or barley are washed, soaked, steamed, inoculated with filamentous fungi Aspergillus oryzae, and incubated until they form a cake of hyphae-encrusted koji. These grains become the inoculant for the second stage of fermentation. For my koji, I used three distinct grains. The first was medium grain rice, and is a traditional Japanese substrate. The second was a medium peated distilling malt, a malted barley smoked with peat that you would probably recognize in an Islay or Speyside Scotch whisky. The final grain was Shepherd's Delight, a roasted specialty malt rich in dried fruit, caramel, and sherry notes, commonly used in red ales.
I'm producing my koji today. I'm doing a traditional rice koji, just as a bit of a backup. I'm also producing a medium peated distilling malt, traditionally used in smoky Islay style whiskies. Real meaty, umami, smoky, earthy kind of profile that should work really well with, the amino acids produced in miso production. And I've also got Shepherd's Delight, which is a nice red ale malt, really big, fruity, full of caramel, all that good stuff. I'll be steaming in a traditional bamboo steamer so that the grains end up nice and plump, they're not waterlogged. And I've got my Koji spores here, Aspergillus oryzae. So, first stage in preparing your koji is soaking the grains. So I've soaked my rice overnight, which is fairly standard. The barley itself, the Noma Guided Fermentation recommends a 4 hour to overnight soak for their barley misos. However, they use pearl barley, which is unmalted. I've had a bit of a play, and for these guys, I think I'm going to soak them for about 2 hours and then give them a good steam. So hopefully it'll go as planned.
Grains were inoculated with 1% of their total weight in koji powder. After inoculation, my grains were loaded into bamboo steaming baskets in an attempt to mimic the traditional wooden barrels, or kyoke, in which miso production traditionally occurs. I incubated my grains in a wine fridge sitting at 20 degrees. Although Aspergillus oryzae's optimum growth temperature is 20 to 30, I expected that exothermic reactions would allow the chamber temperature to rise. Koji fermentation also requires high relative humidity of approximately 60 to 80, although higher is generally safer. While I'd planned on using a humidifier to increase humidity, it did not arrive in time. In the end, I decided to place a small pot of just boiled hot water in the chamber at the beginning of each day, which seemed to provide ample humidity. Within 52 hours, my rice koji and my peated barley koji had formed dense mats of filamentous hyphae, turning the grains into a fuzzy slab of goodness. The Shepherd's Delight had seen less growth and did not reach the desired level of transformation for a further 48 hours. I later speculated that the roasting process that Shepherd's Delight undergoes to develop its signature flavors likely resulted in many of the starches that would otherwise support A. oryzae's growth being converted into sugars, and thus less available to A. oryzae. It did get there, however, and the result was fantastic.
Inside my incubation chamber, it's sitting around 28 degrees. As you can see, there's quite a bit of humidity built up in there. So this is about 52 hours since I started fermenting these. As we can see, the peated malt is very, very well covered. The Shepherd's Delight, not so much. I've also got some rice here. That as well is nice and fuzzy. I'm thinking, so Shepherd's Delight is a roasted malt and undergoes roasting to caramelize the internal starches and sugars. And I'm thinking that's probably made it less available to the Aspergillus, so it might be a bit of a slower initial ferment. But in the meantime, I can get started with this guy, so let's go. As you can see, there's quite a stark difference between my peated distilling malt substrate and my Shepherd's Delight substrate. I haven't seen the desired level of growth on the Shepherd's Delight. Very little, in fact. Shepherd's Delight does undergo a roasting process to create more caramel and fruity flavors, and I'm thinking that this process has probably made some of the nutrients unavailable to a simple organism like Aspergillus oryzae. But I'm going to let it ride and see how it goes from here. In the meantime, I'm going to start with my peated distilling malt. I have my peated distilling malt Koji. So the Aspergillus oryzae spores have quite happily colonized these grains, transforming the substrate and all the starches and proteins within into sugars and amino acids. And this will serve as the inoculant in my roast pumpkin miso. This pumpkin's about to be roasted, it'll then be mashed. I'll incorporate 6 to 10% salt, and I'll add about 55% of the total weight in Koji. So let's kick it.
At this stage of fermentation, optimal substrate, temperature, and conditions has allowed Aspergillus oryzae to thrive, multiply, and sporulate. It has enzymatically converted the starches contained within the malted barley to simple sugars that can be utilized by themselves or other halo-tolerant microbes within miso as a food source. These grains contain high levels of healthy colony-forming units, ready and primed for the second stage of fermentation, where they are pitched into a protein-rich substrate to generate amino acids and fatty acids, resulting in delicious umami flavors. With my first stage of fermentation complete and my inoculant prepared, it was time to ready my second substrate. A Japanese Kent pumpkin was peeled, diced, and roasted until tender, at which point it was blended until fine in a food processor. Pumpkin puree was combined with each Koji variety in a 45 to 55% ratio, with an additional 4% of the total weight added in salt to inhibit competing microbial growth and lower water activity, while allowing desirable halophilic microbes to survive. The resulting mash is quite coarse, more so than commercial miso production I've observed. Nevertheless, each mix was packed firmly into glass jars. The top of each miso was lined with baking paper and weighed down with bags of stones to prevent air pockets, with the top of each fermenting vessel sealed with chuck's cloth to facilitate aerobic gas exchange. Jars are then placed at an ambient temperature at around 22 degrees to ferment. 2 weeks later, fermentation was progressing well. Surprisingly, the youngest of the 3 misos on the left, the Shepherd's Delight, exhibited the most robust flavors and aromas, with strong soy and sweet fruit notes. The pumpkin smelled quite similar to initially, and the peated distilling malt emanated lovely wafts of smoke and prosciutto funk. Small amounts of gas production was observed in the tamari, or liquid of the ferment, and delicious aromas of umami were emanating from each vessel, all positive indicators that fermentation was progressing as planned.
Hey everyone, so it's about 3 weeks into my miso ferments. I'm looking at packaging today, so I'm going to process the misos until they're quite fine and then pasteurize. Up here we've got the Barley Koji miso, the darkest and richest of the 3. That's only about 2.5 weeks old, to be honest, but it's smelling and tasting fantastic, and I think it'll go really well. The straight traditional rice pumpkin miso is probably the least developed of the 3. We're going to process it and see how it comes out. And the peated distilling malt Koji, which is about 3 weeks old now, is smelling and tasting fantastic. And that's definitely ready to be processed, so looking forward to how that will come out. So even after only 3 weeks fermentation, this Barley Koji is exhibiting fantastic umami profile. You can smell all of the very rich amino acids in the solution. The grains started breaking down, and it's just vastly different from the substrate at its inception. So very pleased with it. Let's have a look here. It's kind of looks like chocolate crackles or something, but it's quite sticky. It smells full of like kind of autolysis and
soy and like monosodium glutamate and whatnot. Very reminiscent of kind of like a Vegemite kind of thing, which is potentially an application for this. So we'll see how it comes out.
Before I concluded my processing, 2% of each miso's total weight was incorporated with 96% food-grade ethanol, a commonly employed measure of stabilization within miso production.
And now my Shepherd's Delight Barley Miso is quite a bit finer. And now I'm going to decant into jars and pasteurize. So this is my peated malt Koji miso. Of the three I've tried, this is the best. It's got this beautiful, cheesy, prosciutto-y funkiness going to it, and it's just like really rich and savory and such a beautiful profile. I think this will make a great soup base, a great seasoning base. Really excited to play around with it. So if my miso is now processed to a fine paste and the organoleptic properties deemed desirable, it is time to package and stabilize. While many fermented foods utilize pH as a measure of stability, this is not a strategy commonly employed within miso production. Instead, most miso producers work on water activity principles. By producing products with low quantities of free unbound water, the metabolic activities of microbes cannot continue, thus stabilizing the product. Unfortunately, water activity meters are quite expensive, and few low-tech methods exist for analysis. While I could store, transport, and sell my miso in a chilled format, I'd like my customers to experience the product as it was intended at the time of the packaging, and so I'll pasteurize the product to inhibit any further microbial process. FDA reports determine that a kill step of 20 minutes at 65°C is sufficient to inactivate Aspergillus oryzae. So I've got my water bath sitting here at 65. I'm going to immerse my jars in there. I'm probably going to let them sit in there for about 45 minutes, just because the jar is quite thick and I want the temperature to get all the way through. And from there, they should be nice and stable. So I'm going to put them in now.
At the conclusion of my miso production, I'm honestly very pleased with the products I've created. While each of the miso are reminiscent of conventional misos, they each exhibit a depth of complexity and nuance that I hadn't experienced in miso before. The resulting products are unique and very marketable within the fermented and specialty food sector. I hope to produce much more of them. I was particularly pleased with the reduced fermentation time from using pumpkin as the second substrate. I was initially a little concerned due to reduced protein content compared to traditional soybean, and thought that it may result in reduced amino acids and umami. But the products are not lacking at all in that regard, and being able to turn around a product in under 30 days compared to 3 to 36 months designates it as a very attractive product and recipe to scale. I believe scaling such a product would be fairly achievable, with the biggest bottleneck being acquiring additional incubation space and equipment. But I believe I could likely turn around 80 to 120 kilo batches in a small commercial kitchen space, using a combination oven to sterilize and cook my substrates, a large industrial Hobart mixer to combine my substrate and inoculant, a temp humidity controlled double door display fridge for incubation, and sterilized second use oak barrels for fermentation. Of course, a water activity meter would be an essential tool to further optimize health and safety. With these considerations in mind, I have already started planning for the future. Thanks to my product mentor, I have a lead on high-quality commercial Koji starters, with varying levels of differential enzyme activity, and believe that I could further optimize my process by selecting an appropriate strains for my specialty substrates. Who knows, perhaps someday you'll find one of my specialty miso products in a gourmet grocer. In the meantime, while mini molds are scary, don't fear the fuzz.